One of the shortcomings of Scrum is that it only focuses on the actual process and doesn't talk about any of the engineering practices that we need to do. What we found here at LeanDog is that if we leave out these engineering practices, Agile or Scrum is really not sustainable over the long term. The developer role is kind of central to the engineering practices. So what I'd like to do is just take a few moments and kind of go through what the day looks like for a developer on an Agile team. Typically, we kick off the morning with our stand up where we kind of figure out what story we're playing with or going to be working on that day, who we're going to be pairing with, and then after stand up we get busy. Uh, we select our pair, we sit down, we start working on a story. The day for us is all about pairing and it's all about test driving our code. So we start off by writing a simple test. Then we work to make that test pass, and then refactor and we repeat that pattern again and again and again. If your team's doing acceptance test-driven development, you're also in a constant talk or discussion with the tester on your team, where we're talking about how the automation is going to actually work with or integrate with the code that we're writing. We'll have discussions around what those integration points look like, the discussion around the various tests that we're working on, and then our TDD focus becomes driving code, hopefully from the outside in, that helps the next acceptance test pass. I like to switch pairs somewhat frequently, so I would try to limit my pairing session with my first pair to about half of the day or so, and and around the half a day point, I would either decide that I was going to move on to another story or that the person I'm pairing with will, and we continuously rotate pairs in that fashion. So, test driven development is the practice that we use to actually drive our code. So, we don't believe we should write a line of production code until we have a failing test. And part of the secret to getting this right is in taking those tiny, tiny, tiny steps of a test, that we write these very simple little tests, write the simplest code we can possibly conceive of to make that test pass. And when we're done, we look for ways to evolve the design or to refactor the code. And those little bitty steps are very quick. I try to limit that whole cycle or of writing a test, make it pass, refactor to 3 or 4 minutes or so. And if I find that it's taking a little bit longer than that, I tend to start to get nervous and start to step back and say, why is this taking so long? And might be like it fairly likely to delete all that code and go back to my last green checkpoint and reevaluate what's going on, possibly refactor the code a little bit then before I write the next test. So what am I looking for as a driver for refactoring? Kind of, I guess I let pain be the driver a little bit, or at least when I'm working in a new code base, I do. So if I find that the next test is difficult for me to write, I would stop and delete that test and go back and try to understand why it was difficult. It usually is because the code that I'm working with is not quite as clean as I want it to be. So it would be an opportunity again to go back and refactor the code a little bit. Other drivers that help me understand when it's time to refactor is if I start to add conditionals to my code, then I'm all of a sudden feeling a little dirty and start to think that maybe the code's too complex. If my method gets over 5 or 6 lines of code, I really start to think about, what am I doing here? Am I doing too much? Does the code that I'm working on belong somewhere else? If I find I have a lot of private methods in my class, that also might be an indicator that I'm doing too much. And definitely, a lot of public methods is also an indicator to me that the class tends to be doing too much. Method size, class size, complexity. What else? Dependencies. If I find that I'm spending a lot of time setting up mocks in my test or setting up fakes in my test because the class that I'm driving has a lot of dependencies, that to me is again a huge trigger to go back and refactor the code that I'm working on because too many dependencies for me is the smell. How many is too many? I don't know. 2 or 3, and I start to get nervous. So I start to look for ways to evolve the code or to clean it up a little bit more at that time. So I guess those are some of the things that I would like to say about being a developer. Having a passion for clean code and having a passion for keeping the code well factored at all times is essential. There tends to be a lot of pressure coming to move faster, and I've seen again and again developers make the decision whenever they feel that pressure to not test drive their code, and I've never seen that effort be successful. What I've seen when we try to rush is that we end up taking shortcuts. The code becomes more brittle. The code and our defect count rises, or we see defects in the code, which forces us to go back and rework code. So, from my perspective, if we feel pressure to go faster, I push back against that pressure because I know that the only way I could truly go as fast as I can go as a developer is by continuing to follow these practices, continuing to test drive my code, continuing to keep my code clean, because that's how I'm able to produce code that has zero or very, very few defects, and code that in which the amount of rework that I have to do is negligible or none in most cases.